Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be in this fine world. You are listening to the Startup Selling Show, Talking Sales with Scott Sambucci. That's me. Today's episode is a guest episode, and today's guest is Eric Quanstrom. Eric is the Chief Marketing Officer at CIENCE, spelled CIENCE, science without the S. And at CIENCE, as the Chief Marketing Officer, he leads all of their marketing efforts, obviously to create brand awareness, cultivating their passionate fans. Over the course of his career, Eric has held a variety of different executive positions, including a CMO at Pipeliner CRM, Nimble, and Sorenson Media. He's also been a VP of marketing at SightSpeed, which was acquired by Logitech. It's a company you probably recognize. He's been a director of business development. He's been a West Coast head of sales. So this guy knows sales. He knows marketing. He knows go-to-market. So I wanted to have him on the show because of the way that they are approaching this notion of going out to market over at CIENCE. They have a very specific way and a worldview on what else we could be doing beyond this sort of list building and batch and blast approach to outbound and outreach, as well as how you can start to think about partnerships with outsourced SDR agencies like theirs as a way for early stage, growth stage founders to get a lot more out of those engagements should you wish to go in that direction. So a couple of key things that Eric and I talked about is really kind of two main topics to listen for. So number one, we spent a good chunk of time talking about outbound, which is obviously a really broad topic. So we took that very broad topic and defined the three different ways or processes, or however you want to think about it, three different ways that you could be doing outbound. So one is what we call the list building, which is the one that most of us are familiar with, the list building approach to outbound. The second is through intent-led outbound. And the third, which I think is probably the most interesting and where we spent the most time, the third way is what we call inbound-led outbound. Inbound-led outbound. So a little oxymoronic, but it absolutely works. And they've got the science with an S to prove it. So you definitely want to listen about that because I think it will help shift away and shift your thinking away from just thinking about must get ICP lists, must send emails, must send LinkedIn messages to everyone that matches a certain title within the companies we want to sell to. Yes, that's helpful. Yes, that's important. And yes, that can be effective. However, these sort of newer approaches around intent-led and this inbound-led outbound could be even more effective so that your opportunity cost of time, which is so expensive, is spent more of that time is spent working on better deals, qualified deals, and people with actual intent to make a purchase. So that was one big topic we talked about. Then we spent a few minutes at the end of the conversation talking about what does it mean to work with an outsourced agency. I'm not sure about you and your situation. I've certainly talked to dozens of founders over the last couple of years that have worked with an outsourced agency. They said, look, here's an outbound SDR agency. We're going to have them send out emails, book meetings for us, and help us fill the sales pipeline. In fact, just today, I talked to a company founder that is doing just that. The problem that this founder has, and the problem that many other founders have, is that oftentimes either that agency is not booking the meetings at all, or the meetings they're booking are not qualified meetings. So good news, lots of meetings. Bad news, none of those meetings are qualified. So you're spending a lot of money, spending a lot of time and a lot of your resources with this outbound agency, but not getting the results you want. And so Eric and I talked about what are the necessary conditions in order for that kind of relationship to work well for an early stage, growth stage founder. And a lot of that comes down to ownership, partnership, and readiness. Ownership, partnership, and readiness. So we talk a bit about that towards the end of our conversation. So if outbound's a thing for you, you want to be more effective, you want to think a little bit differently on how you can be more effective in your outbound, and you want to think about how you might leverage partners like CIENCE as a way to help you gain more scale to your outreach and your lead generation, then this is the episode for you. That's why I had Eric on the show. So thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already, by the way, take a moment and just hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode wherever you're listening to this podcast, whether it's on Apple Podcast, Spotify, SoundCloud, wherever else. Also, would really appreciate it if you could just tell a friend or 10, shoot them flick them a quick note, say, I'm listening to this episode right now. You might find it interesting. Viral is still the best way for us to get the word out about this podcast. We still see listenership go up, subscriptions go up, downloads go up. And it's mostly because of the work that you were doing each and every day to get the word out about this show. So if you haven't already, please do that. Let other people know so that we can keep bringing you the good stuff that we're bringing here on the Startup Selling Show. So that's it for now. Let's head over to my conversation with Eric Quanstrom. Eric, welcome to the show. Good to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here, Scott.
Thanks so much for making time in what is your very busy day as Chief Marketing Officer at CIENCE. So like I always do with all of our guests, Eric, folks have already listened a little bit about you and your background and some of the things we're going to be talking about today. But I'd love for you to just describe for folks like, hey, Eric, when people ask you, what do you do? How do you answer that question?
You know, it's a variety of activities, high to low, strategic to tactical, all around kind of the marketing activities at CIENCE to where we can put ourselves in the path of any of our would-be buyers, raise awareness of our company's brand, tell them about our products and services and how we might help them grow. Because that's really what CIENCE is in the business of doing, is helping our clients grow their own sales pipelines and helping them, essentially get net new revenue in the door.
Grow pipeline, net new revenue. Okay. I think it's worth listening to the next little bit. Those are always topics people care about, especially now.
Yeah, you think so.
And for everyone listening, like Eric's using the word science, and I said the CMO at CIENCE. So CIENCE is CIENCE, the company CIENCE, as opposed to the topic of science. We might use those words a little bit. Yeah, of course.
The word science.
So just listen for that as we're going along. And so you and I were just kind of chatting a little bit before we hit the record button on a couple of topics. And, among the many things you guys do at CIENCE, a big part of what you're doing is helping teams with outbound. And one of the things that's always interesting to me is like you and I being in the sales and marketing space for decades, we know that this idea of outbound can be a really important strategy for a lot of companies. The problem is sometimes even or especially for, say, early stage founder or early stage team, it's just getting the first couple of million in revenue. They're thinking like, I got to do outbound. But they're not necessarily clear on what is outbound and what are the different forms of outbound, because to them, it's just like, oh, outbound means I send a bunch of emails, right? Like, well, kind of. So I would love for you to describe what you call the 3 different types of outbound, and maybe we can dig into a bit of each of those 3. So what were those 3 forms of outbound that you and I were chatting about before we hit that record button?
Yeah. So quick definition, probably the most practiced form of outbound is list-led outbound. List-led can give rise to intent-led outbound. And then finally, inbound-led outbound are our 3 forms that we're going to be talking about. Taking a quick step back and peeling the onion, if you will, the reason why most people practice list-led outbound, and I think that's the most familiar conception of how to do outbound, is because that's what's been practiced for, frankly, the last few decades, if you will. And so it's basically coming up with an ideal customer profile. Who should I be doing business with? Oftentimes there can be a lot of rigor. There can be a lot of strategy. There can be a lot of, heavy lifting on who joins that list. But ultimately, it's still developing kind of like that target set of companies and contacts that I would want, or that I see if I'm going 0 to 1, like a startup does, conceptualizing who my buyers are or could be. And so that's really where that list part comes in. And then from an outbound perspective, most people are working list-led outbound from kind of, A to Z or a geo patch. So they're taking a territory and they're working their way low to high or some other methodology that oftentimes isn't associated with strategy at all, but is convenient for them to work what's known as a sequence. And so a sequence is a series of touches, usually defined by channel. So prominent channels in our world are email, phone, social networks like LinkedIn. And then we also include the web channel and advertising as a separate discrete channel going forward. You could also mix in video, direct mail, but typically those are your channels. And then a sequence would be what touches when on a given pattern to a given set of contacts on that list. And voila, you have list-led outbound.
Yeah. Now, and then, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the important component that might have been missed by a lot of people is like there should be, like, if you're going to take list led, it doesn't mean it's like you shouldn't do it. There's plenty of places where you could do it, and maybe you should do it. But one thing that you said in there that may have been missed, which is like there's some heavy lifting, there's some rigor, there's an ICP that we're going after, and that alone, like, is a step that many people skip. They're like, oh, we sell to banks, so we're going to get a list of all the banks and all the executives at banks in the United States and start blasting out emails. And that's not really list led as much as everything led or every company led. So I like at least the notion that however you want to slice and dice your target market, it could be, we're talking about banks, maybe it's regional banks or banks in California or banks that make a certain kind of loan type, maybe banks that offer small business lending to companies in the manufacturing sector. Those kinds of ways of paring down from a very, very large market down to a specific list. And that's where the rigor and the heavy lifting comes in.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that we see kind of like all the time that's fascinating is this could be its own podcast, and we could spend hours here, because as you develop product market fit, as you develop what I like to call prospect market fit with your product or services, your solution to the market, and develop it, that buying cohort will change. That buying cohort will evolve. You're thinking about who is the first person you should be meeting with in any sales cycle, and the last person you should be meeting with in that sales cycle, the check signer, if you will evolve. And recognizing that, and even knowing kind of like how to experiment with an ICP, what lists to test, what personas to go after, how to talk with them about like their given problem space, if you will, and where you want to enter the conversation is high art. And so like in your banking example, like one of the pernicious problems that I see all the time with outbound and list-led outbound is a tendency to come in and one size fits all. So for instance, I want to talk to the C-suite because they're the decision makers, and darn it, like that's who we want to go after. Turns out that if you kind of like stack rank and think probabilistically, getting an appointment, getting a sales cycle started with Jamie Dimon at Chase because he's the CEO of a bank, not that likely. You know what I mean? Like,
especially nowadays. Yeah. Right.
For whatever that's worth. The point being, and I'm trying to use humor to kind of like really make the point, there's a lot of shortcomings with list-led outbound that also detail, if you're not sophisticated in the way that you create that list and attack it, you can have underperformance. You can have less than favorable results. You can kind of start making value judgments about outbound and like, this doesn't work. Well, how did you attack the problem? It's kind of like step number one. And so that leads to, or maybe it's a nice segue into talking about other flavors or forms of outbound. For instance, intent-led. So the one other piece that I would just want to get out of the way, and when I talk about list-led outbound, the one other kind of like facet, and it's not a feature, it's actually a bug if you want to think in software terms. List-led is vendor-led. It means you are conceptualizing who you should do business with, but it has no concept whatsoever of, do those people want to do business with you? Right? So in a sense, like you're relying on serendipity and luck from a timing perspective when you're reaching out to those people. And those tend to be, the estimates vary, but like most people will say that most companies, broad brush painting, are in market about 4% of the time, right? So like best case scenario, you're hitting people completely cold. And that's where the phrase cold call or cold email, cold outreach really comes from, because you're reaching out to people that maybe aren't in the market for anything that you're doing. And you're trying to kind of like rub two sticks together, make fire from scratch.
Yeah. So I think to jump in here, I think what's important there is like, especially as a startup, like you said, do those people want to do business with you? Like they don't even know who you are in most cases. Right. And so whether or not they want to do business with you or not, it's this notion of being in market or not. Like, are they problem aware? Are they actively looking for a solution to whatever problem it is that you could solve for them? And I've heard similar numbers, the 4% that you mentioned. I've heard as high as 10%, but that 10% of a market is actually two groups. I've heard about 3%, which are actively looking, And then the other 7% of that 10 are people that are open to buying. I mean, they're not necessarily actively looking for a solution, but if a solution to a key problem presented itself, then they would be open to beginning a sales cycle. So that 3% is really the ones that are actively looking, which is very close to that 4% you cited. But in any case, whether it's 3%, 4%, or 5%, whatever it is, it's a really small amount, which is the idea of like most of the work that you're going to do in this list bed is going to be exhaust. You're going to put in a lot of energy for very little results, even if those results are somewhat predictable. Like, okay, I send out 100 emails and I get 3 meetings. That's okay. But what about those other 97, right?
That's exactly right.
So let's talk about that as a segue into intent-led.
Yeah, and so intent-led starts to introduce this idea of if we could look out across the landscape, most intent products are based on information that is pulled from the public web around the behavior of people as they visit web pages. We have our own intent product. It's called Science Go Intent. And the way that our product is architected is, we are actively watching 33.8 million web pages across the internet and determining the underlying topics of those pages so that we can glean when a company is on that page, we have reason to believe that they're interested in that topic. And then we have a variety of lead scoring that mixes back in this idea that, okay, this gives us a signal that this might be an in-market company. And obviously we can have gradients of how strong that signal is. But what this introduces is kind of a wholly different concept than just straight list led, because now you're concentrating on the companies that match my ICP. So it's still important to create that kind of like who I would want to do business with, but overlaid against, are they potentially in market themselves? Is their company showing any kind of signaling or intent in my areas of promise or in our vocabulary, in our topics?
Mm-hmm. Got it. So you're almost like taking that big list and paring it down to just that 3%, or it's probably more than just the 3%. Maybe it's 10, 15, 20%, but zeroing in on those people that are indicating through some signals, which may or may not be true signals, but historically speaking or probabilistically, that activity would indicate typically that it would trend towards they may in fact be in market. So let's spend time with those folks. Yeah.
And I would also say for the vast majority of your listeners who are probably venture-backed startups, it's exceptionally rare for a company to receive venture funding that doesn't have a fairly large total addressable market that they're attacking. And so
that's why, yeah, exactly. Yeah, they don't get VC funding if the TAM is like 10 million, right?
Exactly. So, in a sense, this is an exercise in organizing one's TAM or one's TAM approach that is potentially more logical and a bit more strategic than, again, other criteria that you might use that are exclusively list-led. So now that bucket's described, there's still a third class of outbound that I think is probably superior to both list-led and intent-led.
This is where we get to the science behind science, right? This is
where we get to it. Yeah.
When you explained this to me before we got on, I was like, oh yeah, I want to hear about this. So
yeah, and ironically, this is also the biggest gap, in my opinion, of what I've observed between marketing and sales departments the world over. So what I'm talking about is inbound led outbound. So the typical website, the typical B2B SaaS website has a lot of, kind of like investment into that website and into bringing visitors to that website, whether that's pay-per-click, whether that's any form of other advertising, whether it's social promotion, whether that's SEO and content, whatever you're doing to bring people to your website, make people familiar with your brand, kind of like architect the experience, if you will, on that website for people to raise their hands and say, yeah, I'd love to do business with you. The truth of the matter is that the vast majority of websites, especially in B2B SaaS, as but one industry to focus on, it's typically a 1% conversion rate.
How do you measure when you say conversion rate? That means they'll request a demo or ask for more information or download something. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, my marketing brethren will oftentimes define an MQL very broadly. So could even include not just request a demo or talk to sales, but download this ebook or take this guide or attend this webinar. Myriad number of calls to action, and yet the on good authority, depending on the analytics tools, and they publish these year in, year out. Most marketing automation platforms will give you kind of like a industry by industry kind of like conversion rate, unique visitor to whatever the call to action was. It usually lives in the 1% to 5% range.
Okay.
I rarely see anything above that. And when I do, it's in super specialized industries that frankly benefit from like a low denominator. Like they just don't get a lot of traffic.
Right. So, and it's because it's so specialized, the people that would be there, they already know what they're looking for. Or even if it's an SEO driven visit, it might be such a specific search term that it's not like you're competing with a very broad category.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that broad category is a really important concept that I'd love to come back to in just a second. So that the bottom line here is, if you're studying the law of large numbers and you're thinking to yourself, okay, so he's telling us about reality, of course, I've got a 2% conversion rate on my own site. What's new? What's new is, what are you doing with the 98%? How are you actively determining who's in that 98%? What we would call de-anonymization of visitors. So like, are you using tools to look at that traffic stream and then potentially pull out the companies and contacts that are visiting your website, especially those that didn't convert? So that's the main fulcrum point, if you will, that I think influences an inbound-led outbound motion. You first have to know, who is coming to my site? Who should I be targeting? Because they targeted me, because they're now familiar with, or presumably familiar with, my brand, or more familiar than they would have been if I had just put them on a list and gone completely cold. In other words, the reason I want to reach out to you in an inbound-led outbound motion is because you came to me.
All right, folks, we're off and running in my conversation with Eric. Listen, we're talking a lot about outbound and lead generation and prospecting. And obviously, that's one of the key sales strategies, one of the key systems that every company needs to have working in order to get more repeatable, scalable growth in their company. And so whether it's outbound, whether it's your lead qualification, whether it's using your voice of authority to generate more leads, these are all different strategies within that prospecting plan of action that you're going to need to get built. You're going to need to get running. You're going to need to have some predictability and repeatability so that you can scale your lead gen down the road. So this is just one of the many, many things that we work on each and every day with startup founders just like you, to help them build those repeatable, scalable sales that they want to make the impact that they want to make in their marketplace. So if you're one of those founders right now thinking like, man, we could sure use some more high quality leads, and we could sure appreciate doing that in a more efficient way, or we've got an SDR team that's working all right, but we just need to make some adjustments. We need to get a second set of eyes on what we're doing. That's a place where we can step in and help you out. So first thing to do is simply send me an email, Scott@salesqualia, QUALIA.com, Scott@salesqualia, QUALIA.com. Type the word private into the subject line. Lets me know you want to have a quick one-on-one chat. We'll do a quick look at your situation right now, understand where you are with sales, where you are with prospecting and lead gen, and how does that map to where you want and need to be in the next 12, 24, 36 months. And from there, we can jam on some ideas. I can give you some quick tips, and then we take things from there. So if you're just looking for a couple quick ideas, this would be a great opportunity to work with me or somebody on my team. Get on one of these calls, send us an email, Scott@salesqualia.com. Type the word private into the subject line. Lets me know, lets my assistant know you want to have a quick chat. We'll get something on the calendar. We'll have that conversation. We'll help you build and scale your sales process. So that's it. Let's head back to my conversation with Eric. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, a couple of quick, like short examples popped to mind for me in general. Like if you just think about the retail world, here in our town in Davis, there's a bookstore downtown. Now I can go buy books on Amazon and all these other places, but there's this nice little local store. And sometimes like on a Friday afternoon, pick my son up from school, we'll go downtown, and if there's a new anime book or something else he wants, I'll reward him for a good school week. Like, okay, you can get one anime book. But you're in this bookstore, right? And there's lots of people. There could be 20, 30 people browsing around. That bookstore could have 20 or 30 people come in, but how many of them are actually buying stuff, right? So they come in and they visit, they walk the shelves and they leave. Well, what were they looking for in the first place? What actually got somebody to walk into a bookstore and look for a book as opposed to just going to Amazon to buy it, because that's the easiest thing. If I'm sitting at home and I want a book, any book in the world, I can pretty much go to Amazon. But instead, for whatever reason, those people chose to walk into that bookstore. Maybe some of them were just walking by on the way to the coffee shop and they want to check something out. But maybe they wanted to check out the book they just heard about on the Oprah Winfrey Show, or heard about on the New York Times bestselling list, or heard about on a podcast. It's like, gosh, if you only knew what those people are looking for, it would tell you so much more about their buying intent, and maybe you could retarget them somehow. And it sounds like kind of the same idea here with the website. It's like the other 98% that aren't buying a book, we don't know what happens to them. They just go ephemeral.
Yeah, I would even try to be humorous and say, like on the web, it's even more extreme in that regard. Like people don't just show up to your average B2B website like by accident.
True. That's
you know
true.
what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Like looking for the summer reading with John Grisham. Oh, and I found myself on CIENCE.com. Like, no.
Yeah. That's
it
true.
Doesn't really compute.
That's exactly right. Okay. So thank you for clarifying that analogy even more. So I guess like part of me is a little bit curious about, well, you got this other 98% and you're talking about how to go out and do this inbound, outbound. And you don't have to get into too many of the nuts and bolts about how your product works, but how is it possible to even know who those 98% are if people are coming in and they're leaving and they're not clicking that call to action button?
Yeah, I think that there's a big truth waiting to be kind of like acknowledged out there, which is, and I would say this to every listener and even to you, Scott, like think about your own behavior. Of the last 100 websites you visited, how many of them did you actually hit a button, fill a form, and, you know, raise your hand for them, that business to follow up with you? The chances are really good that of the last 100, it was 0.
Right.
So the more common thing that people do when they visit websites is nothing. like right. Literally, that is the most natural human behavior. And the reason I would argue, especially when you marry this up with a sales cycle, is because people are information gathering. People are doing research. People are following, you know, what Google tells them, what a referral link tells them. They follow their interest to your website. Whether they're ready to enter into a buy cycle is usually a huge chasm that doesn't occur until arguably, if you follow kind of like the analyst reports, the Sirius, the Gartner, the Forrester, kind of like 70% of the buying process is done before anyone engages with sales. Right. This is what they're talking about, right? They're talking about people silently behind their laptop, you know, like asking Google for information about a product or service, studying, going vendor by vendor, looking at, you know, review sites or social media posts about X vendor. It's what we call dark social, right? Like when people kind of are information gathering as part of that research pre-buying process, it's very typical that they show up to your website and do nothing, or at least nothing that you as a vendor are taught and build structures around like inbound response acting upon. And so again, where I think that this is why this is, I tease the fact that this is a gap. Marketing usually owns a website, and they usually own the visits to that website, the conversion rate on that website. These are typical KPIs that, you know, CMOs like me care a lot about. How many of those people are converting relative to total traffic? Can I move my conversion rate from 2.13% to like 2.5%? That would be a huge win across X number of traffic.
Right.
But again, the focus here is like, are we missing the forest for the trees here, marketers? Because sales typically own sales, and oftentimes the SDR motion and the follow-up of who gets to join a lead and frankly, who's sales qualified and who starts a sales cycle. And so you have this kind of like dark patch, is probably the best visual I can use, around the people that come to our website but don't express interest. And I'm arguing, and I think CIENCE is kind of one of the champions of this idea that, no, you should bring the fight to those people, the ones that match your ICP, because of what they've done, which is, again, visit you. And so when you have the tools and instrumentation to be able to match, and we'll never match at 100% rate, but like our tool, and there's a bunch of other best of breed tools out there, like ultimately when you can start to determine who's kind of visiting your website and then cross-reference it against your ICP, that's the group that I would argue you want to go after and prioritize above all else with your outbound motions, for the very simple reason that what if they are doing research? What if that person is in a buying cycle at the very earliest stages? Do you want to be the first vendor in?
Mm-hmm.
Every sales leader I've ever talked to in my entire life, all else equal, when I say you're in an inbound situation, which means by default, there's a really good chance that by the time somebody raises their hands, it's you and 5 others on their short list. And everyone that I've ever surveyed, and I put that question to and I press them on it, well, I always want to be the first one in. Always. And that's a pole position. It's a strategic position. And therefore, you should architect the structure of your go-to-market motion to focus on that population.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, just a moment ago, I was doing a little bit of some mental gymnastics around okay, so we can find out with some probability who is it that came to that website from which company, and then we can cross-match it to our ICP list. And then we can start sending them an email or some other kind of outbound motion. It's it feels a little is it too big brothery? But what are we doing already? People go to your website and then you drop a cookie on them, and then you go to Facebook and then you see an ad. It's I was on the Ultra website checking out new running shoes. And then I go back to Facebook a day later, and guess what? There's an ad for Ultra shoes. It's I know that they know that I was on their website. The jig is up. There's no anonymous sort of browsing. And have been cases where I'm oh, I'm glad that ad showed up for me, because they're actually having a 30% off sale from the shoes from last year's model. And I like last year's model, so I'm going to stock up and buy 3 pairs. So I just went and dropped, $250 on the Ultra shoes that I bought from their website that I didn't buy the first time I was on their website, because maybe I got distracted, or maybe I was just checking out the new models, or I was looking at their prices or something else. So I think at the end of the day, that intent that you're talking about is no, people sometimes drop off and be thankful that you follow up with them, because maybe they left for no other reason than they got busy, or the next meeting came and they were just about to get started with some kind of engagement, but forgot about it.
Yeah. And I would also say 2 things. Number one, the B2C model, I think, is well understood, as you just evidenced by your own personal story. We all have a story like that where we've seen retargeting kind of work, and maybe even work on us. So key to messaging with inbound led outbound is not to lean too hard into, I saw you on our website, and therefore that's the reason for my outreach, and being pedantic about it. That said, serendipity and timing matter. You know what I mean? And cutting back through the clutter and following up with a brand that is just getting to know you. And this is my point number 2. I'd argue that every sale that is ever made anywhere in the world is a change management exercise, right?
Mm-hmm.
No change, no sale. Ultimately, you're buying shoes because your old ones are wearing out. The new ones look more stylish. You wanted to achieve something or have something, you had a change in mind when getting those shoes, right?
Of course,
so
yeah.
When it's B2B buying, the change tends to be a little bit more structured, a little bit more consensus, more people weighing in on the change, if you will, more people involved in the decision as what's going to be the ROI of this change? What will we get after we purchase X? And so there's a preamble to all of that, why we call it a sales cycle, I think, to determining fit and function, and is this going to be worth investment? So that change management exercise, I like getting ahead of the change as a vendor. And I like advising or giving strategic kind of advice to others to do likewise, because that's where winning comes from, if you really think about it at its essence. And so, especially in competitive markets, I think inbound led outbound is one of the techniques, methodologies, prioritization practices that everybody should be thinking about and putting on their short list, if you're not doing it today.
Yeah. And there's a lot of creative ways, as you said, to avoid being pedantic and saying, I saw you were on our website. It could be something someone's look, if we know who our ICPs are and there was a person on this company that came to our site, what if I went to their LinkedIn profile? What if I liked or commented some of their posts? Maybe I sent them a connection request. I view their profile. There's a lot of ways that we can engage in a lighter way as a starting point. as opposed to just like, I'm going to hammer you with 4 emails in the next 4 days plus 3 cold calls and ask you if you want to buy something. And that's probably a whole nother podcast in itself as well. So thank you for laying out those 3 forms of outbound. And I think, people listening should start to think through, like, on the one hand, yeah, it's important to know your ICP and get that list and those target accounts, but then start to think through, how can we get better signals and how can we focus those efforts? Because as a founder, or even if you're a later stage company with a sales team, you have to always remember that opportunity cost of time, whether they're working the wrong deals that were never there in the first place, or they didn't, they're not spending time on renewals, or anything in the sales pipeline that they're spending time and not producing revenue. Then this is the same thing, right? If they're spending 90% of their time prospecting and it's not getting meetings, it's like, well, it's never going to be 100% optimized, or 100% of your time is always going to lead to meetings. But what if it could be 40%, 50%, because you're using these smarter ways of thinking about outbound?
Absolutely.
So I want to transition here in the last 5-10 minutes or so, because the other thing that you guys do there at CIENCE is helping with this outbound itself, right? So
yep.
And we have clients that have used outsourcing. I'll use the term outsourcing SDR services. You can correct me if you frame it differently. But the general idea is like, look, I know I need to do outreach. I know I need to do outbound. I'm a founder. I'm a small team, resource constrained, time constrained. Like, I just need someone to do this for me.
Yep.
So I'm going to go find a partner who's going to run this part of our sales process for us. And so I'd really love to get your perspective on, like, when does it make sense, or what's the sort of baseline readiness that a company would need in order to work with a team like yours and have it be effective? And I asked that question because I've had so many unfortunate stories of founders like, oh, I worked with this agency or that agency, and for 6 months, I paid them, $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 a month. They promised me all these leads, and all they did was book me 3 meetings, and all the meetings were crap.
Yeah.
And like, now what? It didn't work. I'm like, oh, yeah, it didn't work, but what were your expectations? What did you prepare them with? So I'd love to just get your perspective in terms of what makes for successful engagement in this situation. What's the minimum amount of readiness? Like, what do you see as best practices, and what are some things to avoid?
Yeah, this is a meaty topic, and we can tackle it from a multitude of angles, but painting in broad strokes, one of the things that I would say is I would actually steal the word that you used earlier when talking about, do I outsource kind of like SDR services? Do I take it in-house? To me, if you are approaching kind of an outsourcing effort and not thinking about that organization as a partner, to use your word, because I think it's the right word, then you're doing it all wrong. If you think of them as a vendor, then boy, help you, like, Lord help you. Mainly because everything matters. And what do I mean by that? I mean the targeting, which we spent ample amounts talking about, like, who is the subject of my outreach? Which flavor of outbound am I doing? If I'm doing list-led, who gets my outreach? And then once the who, how much have I figured out around that person's reasons to care about engaging with me, right? Like, how well do I know that persona? How well do I know their problems? How well do I know their goals or that persona, what they're struggling with? And then I can start to layer on, how familiar with my brand are they? And the answer for startups is usually not at all, which is one of the best reasons for doing outbound in the first place, but oftentimes gets glossed over when people think of it at the end state, like you were kind of like envisioning or laying out the case for, of, yep, I pay the money with this vendor and I'm going to get X number of appointments, and it's coin operated and transactional, and so goes the way of the world, because it's not at all. And again, what I would say there is, like, your perception, and by your, I mean the brand that you represent, the company that you're building products and services for, the people that would use them, your buying group, how do they respond to what it is your stimuli, if you will? That's where the game is played in outbound, always. Why? Because I've yet to see anyone target people that aren't oversubscribed, busy. I like to call it the 3 Bs: busy, bombarded, and bewildered, right? Like as an executive yourself, how often did you say, I'm going to take X number of meetings today with people I don't know that are going to interrupt my day? Like no executive I know has ever said that statement. However, if somebody interrupts them with something that's interesting, relevant, and could help them or their business, then generally we aren't like aggressively, I will never talk to any outsiders, even though my mom told me don't talk to strangers. I will never talk to another person about my business ever. Right? Like that's not the case either. So the real rubber meets the road and how to have success with outsourced vendors such as ourselves is to go into it thinking partnership first. Why? Because one of the most important lessons that you can learn, whether you're doing it in-house or with a partner, is any of the formulas around the problem space that your business exists to help solve.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, like, would you recommend, I use that word readiness as well. Like, is there a certain amount of success or certain number of metrics that, like, even like when we coach our founders, are like, look, I get it that you want to get this SDR work off your plate, and you should want to get it off your plate, but at the right time, when you have some good metrics and you can predictably assess, like, if I do it myself and I'm crafting these messages and targeting these people and showing what the value prop is, and I can predictably say, I send 100 emails and I get 10 replies and I book 3 meetings. Well, until you get there, if you're just like sending CIENCE or somebody else a big list of 1,000 banks and you're saying, get me meetings, like why would you expect that they're going to do any better than you? They're going to do worse than you, because at least you're the founder of the company that's thinking about this every single day. And I've only thought about this company for the last 3 years. And
and even play that out to its logical conclusion. For most founders, it's deeply personal. It's a switch that never goes off, right? Like every founder I've ever met in my life thinks about their company 24/7, 365. Even when they're dreaming, they wake up, writing down notes about their business, of how their business can improve. As such, they have a view on the world of how they want to bend it, how they want to change it, how they want to influence it. And so for them, it's very easy to kind of like get into that kind of like me first, what I want to do for you, or what I want to like solve for you pain point wise, to everyone that they meet. Some people can get wrapped in that kind of like emotion. They can feel the founder's like enthusiasm for, and that's usually where most founders start, is network-based sales, where that enthusiasm is mistaken for a sales process and it just oozes forward. But as you move beyond kind of every sale being founder-led, and arguably you have to, if you're going to scale a company, you have to compete in frankly, the merits of the free market. And the merits of the free market are really not about you. They're all about the person that could be buying or leading a buying group for your product or service. That's the transition that I think most founders would be wise to pay attention to, and use partners such as CIENCE to help figure out, right? Like, I have a hunch, I have a hypothesis, I have an idea of who would be most likely to buy my product or service. What are the hooks? What are the entry points? What are the things they care about that might introduce or build a bridge for them having an openness to that conversation? Guess what? This is where great messaging is born.
Yeah. So in that case, it's different from the one I laid out, which is, okay, I have some baseline metrics and I have some baseline messaging that tends to work pretty well. I just need somebody to do more of it. In this case, what you're doing is you're almost like employing a research team and saying, look, like, I can only get 20 of these out a day. And instead of me only doing a sample size, an N of 20 every day, if I work with a team like yours, I can get an N of 200 a day and quickly iterate on that message, or quickly iterate on the targeting, or quickly iterate on whatever else. Maybe it's the mediums we use to figure out how to get to a place where we have some predictable metrics.
That's precisely right.
And that's a very different thought process. That's like true partnerships. You're like, no, I'm hiring this research team. It's going to work together with me to help me figure out what is the messaging and the targeting. which is a lot different than this scenario of like, well, I needed leads and I was too busy to do any outreach. So I hired some team and signed a 6 months contract and paid $60K and got nothing. It didn't work. It's like, well, it works. It's just you didn't do your part of the work.
Yeah. And so what the example that you threw out there, just to be very clear, like if you already have workable, provable outbound formulas, scripts, email templates, and the like that are very tuned to the personas that are getting them, and you have verifiable results amongst those populations, then yes, a firm like ours can be a scale entity, right? Because a lot of that work that I'm talking about that doesn't exist in most startups cases, let's just be honest, wasn't already done, wasn't already achieved. You know, one of the things that's interesting, and we have our own podcast at CIENCE. I happen to be the host, and we talk to sales leaders, mainly sales development leaders, all the time. And one of the things that is most interesting is we have a lot of hyperscaling and fast growth companies. And this is always the area that they're most concerned about, is understanding which talk tracks for the new SDR off the streets that they hire and that they're training and that they're kind of like working into their mix, if you will, as they go from like one SDR to like 200 on the scale set. Number 199 isn't coming in and winging it. Like they're not coming in and like, here's your leads, you know, Bobby, like go nuts. That's not the way that it happens whatsoever. Yeah. The training on the market and that prospect market fit is everything. And so I'm simply suggesting it's the exact same paradigm with an outsourced, you know, company like CIENCE.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to have that first version of a playbook or a process or something that's a little bit repeatable and a little bit predictable. One of the things we always talk about is that you can't scale what you don't have. So if you're looking to scale a process, but you don't have a process, you can't scale, right? So you have to have some of that baseline in place. And once you have that playbook or process or script or whatever you want to call it, and it's working, then you can scale it. But again, you can't scale what you don't have. So,
amen, because you know, doing more of what doesn't work is
a recipe of insanity, as we all know. And I've had that too, where I've had founders who are like, look, you know, I need some help with my outbound. You know, I've sent out 1,000 emails and I didn't get a reply. Then I sent another 1,000 and I didn't get a reply. So like, should I just keep sending out these emails? And I guess I'll just send out another 1,000 to get those meetings. I'm like, no, you should just like stop sending. Let's go back a couple steps here. Yeah, exactly. Well, good, man. Obviously we could go deep on any one of these, you know, sub threats, but I know you need to get on your way. I've absolutely enjoyed the definition of those three kinds of outbound and helping people understand more of the science with an S, what they could be doing from an outbound standpoint, but obviously, of course, learning about how CIENCE with a C could help them. And then also understanding what it means to be partner first and that sort of baseline readiness. So if folks want to hear more about how CIENCE with a C can help them out potentially, or even if they're just looking for a second set of eyes and how they should be thinking about this process, where's the best place to go? Where can they reach you or somebody on your team?
Yeah, sure. So that's the easy part. CIENCE.com, CIENCE. Intentional misspelling, easy to find. If you want to
science, the word science without the S.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. And all kinds of information about our product, services, philosophies, you name it, all at your fingertips. And then who knows, we'll take some of you folks that listen to this and de-anonymize you. And if you fit our ICP, perhaps start outreach.
There you go. You're gonna get a cold call from Eric at 5:58 a.m. Like, hey, I saw you were on my website yesterday at 4:27 p.m. and I was calling to see if you want to buy something.
Creepier voice.
No, I mean, I will say on your website itself, having done research before we got on, I mean, I love that you've got the podcast you mentioned, you've got guides, you've got a blog, you've got a whole Wikipedia of, you call it a Sciencepedia. It's like common acronyms and terms used in your world. And I think like all of those in itself are worth going over and checking out the site. And then whether you opt in or not, I guess it doesn't matter because they're going to know who you are. So just like suck it up, go to the website, check them out, download something or not, because either way, you might get a ping from them.
I love it.
You know, and then you can see what it's like for you. Because if you're like, I don't know if this thing is right for me, turns out if you're serious enough to go learn a little bit, maybe you'll be happy to get that follow-up email or two or a LinkedIn ping. So, all right, man. So we'll just send everybody to CIENCE without the S, CIENCE.com. Check out more of what you do. Really, really appreciate you making time today, Eric, to share your perspectives and expertise. As soon as we get the show up and running, we'll let you know. You can share it with your tribe. And thanks so much for spending part of your day with us.
My pleasure. Thanks again, Scott.
Talk to you soon. See ya. All right, folks, that is a wrap. Thanks so much for listening to the Startup Selling Show. Again, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. Please do share this with a friend or 10 and leave us a review. If you're listening to this podcast, you enjoyed this episode, you found it to be useful as you're thinking about your sales process, as you're thinking about your prospecting, you're thinking about your outbound, take a second right now, like literally 10 seconds, give us a star rating. Let us know with a couple quick words what you like, what you love. And if you got some guest suggestions, let us know that as well. Those reviews help us know how we're doing, and it also helps these other platforms like SoundCloud and Spotify and Apple Podcasts signal to other people just like you that, hey, this is a good show, and they'll recommend it to folks just like you so they can get as much from these episodes as you are. So please do leave a review. Please tell a friend or 10, and also make sure you subscribe. So that's it for now for this episode of the Startup Selling Show, Talking Sales with Scott Sambucci. Got a lot more of these coming down the road, coming very soon. So looking forward to having you listen to the next show, and we will talk then. See ya.